The old wooden sign hung above the narrow door, creaking softly in the wind. Its faded letters read, "Curiosities and Concoctions," in an archaic, hand-painted script that seemed to glow under the dim, flickering streetlight. The shop itself was nestled at the end of a forgotten alleyway, hidden from the bustling city streets, as if the world had simply forgotten it existed. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood, dried herbs, and something else. Something acrid and metallic, like a faint hint of blood. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The shop's walls were lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of ancient tomes, glass bottles of all shapes and sizes, and strange objects whose purposes were better left unexplored. The shelves were cluttered with an eclectic collection of items: dried animal parts, twisted roots, shimmering powders, and vials filled with glowing liquids in every colour imaginable. An old cuckoo clock hung on one wall, its hands frozen at a time long past, a silent witness to the shop's secrets. A black cat sat perched on a high shelf, its yellow eyes following every movement with a knowing gaze. Behind the counter stood the shopkeeper. He was a tall, thin figure, cloaked in a dark, old-fashioned coat that seemed almost too large for his frame. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his sharp features, but his eyes, a deep, unsettling shade of grey, shone with a strange light. His hands, pale and slender, moved with a practiced grace as he polished a brass mortar and pestle, his fingers tracing the worn engravings on its surface. He was an ageless man, impossible to place in any specific era. His presence seemed to resonate with an aura of quiet authority, a sense that he had seen and known things far beyond the understanding of ordinary people. He hummed softly to himself, an old, eerie melody that seemed to echo off the walls, filling the shop with a sense of unease. The shopkeeper glanced at a large, ancient ledger on the counter, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. The pages were filled with names written in a flowing script, each entry accompanied by a description of a potion, a date, and a curious symbol beside it. Some names were crossed out, while others seemed to glow faintly, as if infused with a hidden power. A soft chime rang through the shop as the front door creaked open. The shopkeeper's lips curled into a faint smile as he looked up. It was always the same. Those who found their way to his shop were drawn by something deep within them, a desire, a need. He could sense it, smell it in the air like the first hint of rain before a storm. He turned to the large, wooden cabinet behind him and opened its ornate brass doors. Inside, rows upon rows of vials glinted in the dim light. He ran his fingers along them, each one carefully labelled in his spidery handwriting: Elixir of Beauty, Draught of Love, Tonic of Power, Brew of Healing. He paused, feeling the familiar thrill that came before a new customer arrived. There was always that moment, just before the door opened, when he felt the possibilities stretching out before him. Each customer brought a new story, a new decision, a new test. Some left the shop changed forever. Others never left at all. He chuckled softly to himself, a sound that seemed to blend with the creaking of the old wooden beams above. He knew what was to come, and he knew that the choices made within these walls would shape fates, for better or for worse. The chime sounded again, louder this time, as the door opened wider, and a figure stepped hesitantly across the threshold. The shopkeeper's eyes flickered with interest. The The first customer of the day had arrived. "Welcome," he said, in a voice that was both warm and unsettling. "To Curiosities and Concoctions. How may I assist you?" And so it began. The Beauty Elixir. The shopkeeper's smile widened slightly as the door creaked open, and a gust of cold wind swept through the shop, rustling the papers on the counter. A woman stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor. She was tall, with a striking face framed by perfect waves of blonde hair. She wore an expensive, form-fitting dress and carried an air of confidence that seemed to precede her like a shadow. She paused, glancing around the dimly lit shop with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Her manicured fingers tapped impatiently on the strap of her designer handbag. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, they fell upon the shopkeeper, who stood calmly behind the counter, his grey eyes gleaming beneath the shadow of his hat. "You're open, then," she stated, more a command than a question. "Always," the shopkeeper replied smoothly, his voice a soft, velvety whisper that seemed to fill the room. "What brings you to Curiosities and Concoctions, miss?" Mariana Dubois," she answered, tilting her head slightly as if she expected him to recognize her name. When he did not, her lips tightened into a faint sneer. "I was told about this place by a friend," she continued, her tone dripping with skepticism. "She said you have things, potions, that can help people like me." The shopkeeper's smile never wavered. "I have many things here," he said, "and all of them can help, in one way or another. What exactly do you seek?" Mariana hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously around the shop. "I need something to make me beautiful, more beautiful than anyone else. My career depends on it," she finally confessed, her voice filled with a mixture of desperation and arrogance. "I'm an actress, you see, but lately, well, people are starting to talk. They say I'm not as young as I used to be, not as, perfect." The shopkeeper's eyes twinkled with understanding. I see. You fear the passage of time, the inevitable decay that comes for us all," he mused, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "And you believe a potion can solve this problem?" Mariana's expression hardened. "I don't care what it takes. I just want to be the most beautiful woman in the room, forever." The shopkeeper nodded slowly, as if he had heard such a request countless times before. He turned to the large wooden cabinet behind him and opened it, his fingers dancing over the vials within. After a moment, he selected a small, ornate bottle filled with a shimmering, golden liquid. "This," he said, holding the vial up to the light, "is the elixir of beauty. One drop will enhance your natural beauty beyond imagination. Your skin will glow, your hair will shine, and your presence will captivate all who gaze upon you. But I must warn you, Miss Dubois, its effects are potent and must be treated with care. One drop only." Mariana's eyes widened with excitement. "I'll take it," she said quickly, reaching for her purse. "How much?" The shopkeeper's smile remained, but his expression grew serious. "The price is not measured in money, Miss Dubois, but in the desire that brought you here. Are you willing to pay the price?" Mariana hesitated for only a second. "Yes, whatever it takes." The shopkeeper nodded and placed the vial gently in her hand. "Remember," he whispered, "one drop only." She snatched the vial and turned to leave, barely acknowledging the shopkeeper's warning. As she exited the shop, the door creaked shut behind her with an unsettling finality. Scene! Mariana's apartment. Mariana wasted no time. Back in her lavish apartment, she stood before a large, ornate mirror, the vial of the elixir of beauty held tightly in her hand. She stared at her reflection, her face still undeniably beautiful, but marked by faint lines and a slight tiredness in her eyes that had never been there before. Her hand trembled slightly as she uncorked the vial. "1 drop," she murmured, mimicking the shopkeeper's words with a sneer, but as the shimmering liquid touched her fingertip, greed overtook her. Why stop at just 1 drop? She was Mariana Dubois. She deserved it all. With a quick, defiant motion, she tipped the vial back and drank every last drop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, she felt a tingling sensation spread across her skin, a warmth that quickly turned into an intense, almost euphoric rush. She watched in the mirror as her skin tightened and glowed, her hair became lustrous and thick, and her eyes sparkled with a youthful vitality she had not seen in years. She laughed, delighted by the miraculous transformation, but the warmth did not stop. It intensified, becoming hot, then scorching. Panic flashed across her face as she felt her skin begin to tighten further, far too tight. She gasped, her hands flying to her cheeks, which felt like they were stretching and pulling painfully over her bones. Mariana screamed, watching in horror as her reflection began to change. Her skin was now unnaturally smooth, almost like porcelain, her eyes wide and glassy, her lips frozen in a distorted smile. Her hair, once full and flowing, began to fall in clumps around her feet. She staggered back, but the mirror seemed to draw her in, her own face now a grotesque mask of beauty, a caricature, a nightmare. She reached up to touch her skin, but it cracked under her fingers, pieces flaking off like dried clay. Desperately, she turned away from the mirror, but it was too late. Her body began to seize, her limbs stiffening. Her screams grew silent as her mouth froze open in a rictus of terror, her eyes wide and unblinking. She felt her muscles turn rigid, her body becoming harder, colder. In moments, Mariana Dubois was transformed into a lifelike statue of herself, a perfect, horrifying monument to vanity and greed. Back in the shop, the shopkeeper stood behind his counter, calmly closing the large ledger where a new name had just been written, Mariana Dubois. He paused, staring at the name for a moment, then slowly crossed it out with a flourish. He chuckled softly and returned to polishing the mortar and pestle, his grey eyes gleaming with a knowing light. The chime rang softly once more, and the shop door creaked open again. Another customer stepped in, drawn by an unseen force, and the shopkeeper's smile widened. "Welcome," he whispered, "to Curiosities and Concoctions. How may I assist you?" The Love Draught. The bell above the door chimed softly as a man stepped inside the potion shop. He was in his mid-30s, with a slight frame and unkempt hair. His clothes were plain and rumpled, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, as if expecting to find something lurking in the shadows. His hands fidgeted with a worn hat, twisting it anxiously in his grasp. The shopkeeper looked up from his ledger, his grey eyes narrowing with curiosity. He could sense the unease radiating from the man, the scent of desperation that seemed to cling to him like a heavy fog. "Good evening," the shopkeeper greeted, with a calm, almost soothing tone. "How may I assist you?" The man hesitated, swallowing hard before speaking. I was told by a friend that you might have something to help me," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow. "A friend, you say? Interesting. What is it that you seek?" The man shuffled his feet, his gaze flitting nervously around the shop. I need a potion," he confessed finally. "A love potion. There's this woman, Sarah. She doesn't even know I exist. I've tried everything, but she won't give me the time of day." The shopkeeper's expression remained neutral, but his eyes seemed to gleam with a strange light. "Ah, unrequited love," he mused softly. "A tale as old as time itself. And you believe that a potion could make her love you?" The man nodded quickly, his eyes pleading. "Yes. I just want her to notice me, to feel the way I feel, just once, to see what I see when I look at her." The shopkeeper leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled before him. "And are you prepared for the consequences?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of warning. The man frowned. "Consequences?" he echoed, his voice tinged with impatience. "I don't care about consequences. I just want her to love me." A faint smile played at the corners of the shopkeeper's lips. "Very well," he replied, turning to the cabinet behind him. He reached inside, his fingers moving with purpose as he selected a small, delicate bottle filled with a deep red liquid that seemed to shimmer in the low light. "This is the Love Draught," the shopkeeper said, placing the vial on the counter between them. "A potent concoction that will make the one who drinks it fall deeply in love with the first person they see. But I must caution you, love is a powerful force, and this potion will magnify that emotion beyond your wildest dreams and nightmares." The man's eyes were fixed on the vial, his breath quickening with excitement. "I'll take it," he said, reaching for his wallet. "How much?" The shopkeeper shook his head slowly. "The price, as always, is not in money, but in the desire that has brought you here. Are you sure you wish to proceed?" The man's hand trembled as he reached out and took the vial. "Yes," he whispered, almost to himself. "Yes, I'm sure." The shopkeeper watched him for a moment longer, then nodded. "One drop, and her heart will be yours," he said softly. "But remember, love is not a thing to be taken lightly." The man barely heard the warning as he clutched the vial tightly in his hand and hurried out of the shop, the door slamming shut behind him with an ominous thud. Scene: a cozy cafe. A few days later, the man found himself seated in a small, cozy cafe. Across the room, Sarah sat with a group of friends, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of his presence. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched her, his hand gripping the vial of the Love Draught, hidden in his pocket. He waited until Sarah's friends went to order more drinks, leaving her momentarily alone. He took a deep breath, slipped the vial out of his pocket, and carefully poured a single drop of the red liquid into her coffee cup. The potion dissolved instantly, leaving no trace. He waited, his heart racing as Sarah took a sip. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, her eyes met his from across the room. She blinked, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more intense. A slow smile spread across her lips and she stood up, moving toward him with a sudden, purposeful stride. "Hello," she said, her voice soft and warm. I've seen you around, haven't I?" He felt a surge of triumph. "Yes," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm Michael." "Michael," she repeated, as if savoring the sound of his name. "I feel like I've known you forever." At first, everything was perfect. Sarah was attentive, affectionate, and seemed genuinely infatuated with him. They spent every moment together, and Michael felt a happiness he had never known. But soon, her attention began to feel suffocating. She would call him dozens of times a day, show up at his apartment unannounced, and follow him wherever he went. Her eyes held a manic gleam, and her love became obsessive, almost frantic. One night, Michael awoke to find Sarah standing over his bed, staring down at him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wide and unblinking. "I love you, Michael," she whispered, her voice unnaturally calm, "and I'll never let you go." Fear gripped him. "Sarah, you're scaring me," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. "I just want to be close to you. Always." Days turned into a nightmarish blur. No matter where he went, she was there. Her obsession grew darker, more violent. She began leaving threatening messages, accusing him of infidelity, and her behavior became increasingly erratic. She screamed at him in public, her love turning into a terrifying, possessive rage. One night, in a desperate attempt to escape, Michael tried to lock himself in his bathroom, but Sarah forced her way in, her eyes blazing with fury. In a frantic struggle, she lunged at him with a kitchen knife, and in self-defense, Michael pushed her back. She slipped, her head striking the edge of the bathtub with a sickening thud. Michael stared in horror as Sarah's lifeless body crumpled to the floor, her eyes still wide with that haunting, obsessive stare. Days later, Michael thought it was over, but he was wrong. The next night, he heard a soft whisper, echoing through his apartment. "I love you, Michael. I'll never let you go." He turned, but no one was there. The lights flickered, and shadows moved unnaturally along the walls. He could feel her presence, her eyes watching him from the darkness. Sarah's spirit haunted him relentlessly. Her ghostly figure appeared in mirrors, her laughter echoed in the dead of night, and her cold breath brushed against his neck. The more he tried to escape, the more she closed in around him, her love transformed into a nightmarish, unending torment. Driven to madness, Michael tried to flee the city, but no matter where he went, she was there. Her spirit clung to him like a curse, an eternal shadow that he could never escape. He realized too late the price of playing with forces beyond his control, the cost of a love that was never meant to be. The Power Tonic. The bell above the door jingled with a sharp, metallic sound, cutting through the quiet of the potion shop. A tall, imposing man in his late 50s entered, his tailored suit sharply creased, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. His face was weathered, marked with lines that spoke of both ambition and ruthlessness. His dark eyes darted around the dimly lit shop, with a mixture of disdain and curiosity, as if he could hardly believe he had found himself in such a place. The shopkeeper looked up from his ledger, a faint smile touching his lips. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "Welcome to Curiosities and Concoctions. How may I assist you?" The man's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, his gaze fixed intently on the shopkeeper. "I was told about this place by someone who said you could help me," he began, his voice commanding but carrying a note of urgency. The shopkeeper tilted his head slightly, the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat obscuring his expression. "Many come here seeking help, mister." "Arthur Crane," the man replied, his tone clipped. "And I'm in need of something very specific. I'm running for re-election and I've encountered some obstacles. I've been a mayor for 15 years. I've ruled this city with strength and conviction. But now..." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Now they're turning on me. The people, the press, even my own party. They've lost faith, and they're starting to see me as the villain." The shopkeeper nodded slowly, his grey eyes flickering with interest. "I see," he said softly. "And you believe a potion could restore their faith in you?" Arthur Crane nodded, his face hardening with determination. "I don't just want them to trust me. I want them to worship me, to hang on my every word. I need power, absolute power over them." The shopkeeper's smile widened ever so slightly. "Power is a dangerous thing to desire, Mr. Crane. It can be given, but it can also be taken away with interest." "I'm not here for a lecture," Crane snapped. "I want results. Can you give me what I need or not?" The shopkeeper chuckled softly. "Very well," he said, turning to the cabinet behind him. He reached for a large, ornate vial, filled with a dark, swirling liquid that seemed almost alive, shifting and churning like a storm cloud trapped in glass. "This," the shopkeeper said, placing the vial carefully on the counter, "is the Power Tonic. A single drop, and you will possess a presence that none can resist. Your words will become commands. Your very gaze a force to be reckoned with. But," he added, his voice growing quiet, "beware. Power taken by unnatural means has a way of becoming uncontrollable." Arthur Crane snatched the vial from the counter, his eyes gleaming with greed. "I've controlled this city for years," he scoffed. "I think I can handle a little more power." The shopkeeper bowed his head slightly. "As you wish. The price is not in gold or silver, but in your intent. Are you prepared to pay it?" Crane's lip curled in a sneer. "I'll pay whatever it takes." The shopkeeper's smile faded, and for a moment his eyes seemed to flash with something darker. "One drop, Mr. Crane," he whispered. "One drop is all it takes." Arthur Crane pocketed the vial and turned sharply, marching out of the shop without a second glance. The door closed behind him with a heavy, final thud. A week later, Arthur Crane stood on a stage before a massive crowd, the vial of Power Tonic hidden in his pocket. He glanced nervously at his advisors, who watched with skepticism. The press had been brutal in recent weeks, and his popularity had plummeted. His speeches, once compelling, had fallen flat. But tonight, things would change. He took a deep breath, uncorked the vial, and carefully let a single drop of the dark liquid fall onto his tongue. It tasted bitter, like ash and iron, but he felt a warmth spread through his body, a tingling sensation that grew more intense with every passing second. He stepped up to the podium, and as he opened his mouth to speak, he felt an energy coursing through him, filling him with a newfound confidence. The crowd, which had been murmuring restlessly, fell silent. "People of this great city," he began, his voice resonating with a power he had never known, "I stand before you, not just as your mayor, but as your leader, your protector, your savior." The words seemed to echo, amplified by some unseen force, and the crowd responded immediately, their eyes wide, their expressions rapt. They cheered, louder than he had ever heard before, their faces filled with admiration and awe. He continued, his voice growing stronger, more commanding. With every word, the crowd grew more frenzied, their cheers more deafening. He felt a surge of triumph, a rush of euphoria. He had them in the palm of his hand, but as he spoke, he began to notice something strange. The faces in the crowd seemed to blur, their expressions shifting from admiration to something more unsettling. Their eyes grew wider, their mouths stretching into unnatural smiles. They began to chant his name over and over, their voices growing louder and more fevered until it became a deafening roar. Crane felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to speak, to calm them, but his voice came out as a whisper. He cleared his throat, tried again, but the words seemed to vanish into the air. Panic gripped him. As the crowd surged forward, their eyes fixed on him with a fanatical intensity. Crane fled back to his office, slamming the door behind him, his heart pounding. He could still hear the chants outside, growing louder, more insistent. He wiped sweat from his brow and reached for a glass of water, his hands trembling. But as he raised the glass to his lips, he noticed his reflection in the window. His eyes, they were darker, almost black, and his skin had taken on a strange greyish hue. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the reflection remained unchanged. His office door burst open, and his chief advisor rushed in, his face pale. "Arthur, they're waiting for you," he stammered, his voice filled with terror. Crane turned slowly, his heart racing. "Waiting for me?" he repeated. "They won't leave," the advisor said. "They're chanting. They won't stop. It's like they're possessed." Crane's eyes widened in fear. He moved to the window and looked out. The crowd was still there, chanting his name, their eyes wide, their faces twisted into unnatural smiles. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his chest, and he doubled over, gasping for breath. His skin burned. His bones felt like they were on fire. He clutched his chest, collapsing to the floor as a wave of agony washed over him. And then he heard it, a voice, whispering in his ear, low and sinister. "You wanted power, Arthur Crane, and now you have it." He looked up, his vision blurring, and saw a figure standing in the shadows of his office. It was the shopkeeper, his face obscured by his hat, his grey eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. What is happening to me?" Crane gasped, his voice trembling. The shopkeeper stepped forward, his smile cold and sharp. "You wanted power over others," he said softly, "but you didn't understand that power comes with a cost. You took from forces beyond your comprehension, and now they will take from you." Crane's eyes widened in terror as he realized the full extent of his mistake. The crowd outside was not just a crowd, it was a gathering, a cult, formed by the very power he had sought to wield. And now, they were his followers, forever bound to him. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to move. He felt his body stiffening, his muscles locking in place. He reached out, but his hands had turned to stone, his flesh hardening, his veins filling with cold, dark liquid. His screams were swallowed by the sound of the chanting outside, growing louder, more frenzied, as he transformed into a lifeless statue, a monument to his own ambition and greed. Back in the shop, the shopkeeper calmly closed his ledger, another name freshly written and crossed out, Arthur Crane. He turned to the door as the bell chimed once more. A new customer stepped inside, drawn by that familiar, desperate need. "Welcome," the shopkeeper said, his voice soft and welcoming, "to curiosities and concoctions. How may I assist you?" And so the cycle continued, weaving its dark, twisted web. The Healing Brew. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the door creaked open, letting in a shaft of golden light from the setting sun. A woman stepped inside, glancing around the dimly lit shop with a mix of curiosity and quiet determination. She was in her mid-30s, with tired eyes and dark hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her face bore the marks of sleepless nights and worry, but there was a calm strength in her demeanour. She wore a simple nurse's uniform, and her hands were slightly calloused, evidence of years spent in service to others. The shopkeeper, standing behind his counter, looked up from his ledger. His grey eyes studied her carefully, and a faint smile touched his lips. "Good evening," he said in his usual, soft, velvety tone. "Welcome to Curiosities and Concoctions. How may I assist you?" The woman hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer to the counter. "I'm not sure if I'm in the right place," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "A patient, a little girl. She told me about this shop. She said you have things here that can help people." The shopkeeper's smile widened slightly. "We do have many things that can help, miss." "Rebecca," she replied. "Rebecca Turner. I'm a nurse, and I work at the children's hospital down the street. We have a patient, a young boy, Timmy. He's very sick, and the doctors have tried everything, but he's not getting better." The shopkeeper nodded, listening intently, his eyes never leaving her face. "And you believe that I have something that can help this boy?" Rebecca's expression was earnest, almost pleading. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I've heard stories, strange stories. I don't usually believe in things like this, but I'm desperate. He's so young, and he deserves a chance. I'll do anything to help him." The shopkeeper paused, then slowly turned to the cabinet behind him. "There is something," he said softly. "A potion that could cure any illness, no matter how grave. But," he added, glancing back at her, "its effects depend entirely on the intentions of the one who uses it. Are you certain that your purpose is pure?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded firmly. "I just want to help him," she whispered. "He's a child. He hasn't had a chance to live yet." The shopkeeper reached into the cabinet and carefully selected a small, delicate vial filled with a clear, shimmering liquid that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He placed it gently on the counter between them. "This is the Healing Brew," he said. "A single drop will bring healing, but only if used with a pure heart and a selfless intent. I must warn you, however, any deviation from that path, any selfish desire, and its effects will turn unpredictable." Rebecca picked up the vial, cradling it in her hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise. I'll use it for good." The shopkeeper inclined his head slightly. "I believe you," he murmured. "But remember, the outcome is in your hands." Rebecca nodded and turned to leave, the vial clutched tightly in her hand. The door closed behind her with a gentle click, and the shop fell silent once more. Rebecca hurried back to the hospital, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. She entered Timmy's room quietly, careful not to disturb him. The boy lay on the bed, pale and frail, his breathing shallow and laboured. Machines beeped softly around him, their sounds a constant reminder of his fragile state. Rebecca glanced at the vial in her hand, then at Timmy. She hesitated for a moment, fear gripping her. What if it didn't work? What if the shopkeeper was just a charlatan, or worse? But then she looked into Timmy's innocent face, and she felt a surge of determination. She opened the vial and carefully let a single drop fall onto Timmy's lips. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained quiet. The machines continued their monotonous beeping, and Rebecca's heart sank. But then, Timmy's eyes fluttered open, and he took a deep, steady breath. His colour began to return, and the pallor that had clung to his skin seemed to fade. He blinked, looking around the room, and then smiled up at Rebecca, his eyes bright and clear. "Hi, Nurse Rebecca," he whispered, his voice stronger than it had been in days. Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes, and she laughed, relief flooding her. "Hi, Timmy," she replied, her voice trembling. "How do you feel?" "Better," Timmy said with a grin. "Much better." Rebecca glanced at the monitors. The readings had stabilized. The signs of the disease seemed to have disappeared. She felt a wave of gratitude, a warm glow spreading through her chest. The potion had worked. But as she turned to leave the room, she noticed something strange. The air seemed to shimmer around her, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw the faint outline of a figure. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, standing by Timmy's bedside, her expression serene and gentle. Rebecca blinked, and the figure vanished. She shook her head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, and hurried out of the room. That night, Rebecca sat in her small apartment, holding the empty vial in her hand. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She had done something good, something that truly mattered. But a small voice nagged at the back of her mind, a question she couldn't quite shake. What was that figure she had seen? Was it real, or just her imagination? As she pondered, a soft knock sounded at her door. She stood, puzzled, and opened it. There stood the shopkeeper, his hat casting shadows over his face. his grey eyes twinkling with something unreadable. "Good evening, Miss Turner," he said politely. "I see the potion served its purpose." Rebecca frowned, surprised. How did you know?" The shopkeeper chuckled softly. "I know many things," he replied. "I simply wanted to ensure that you used it wisely. And it seems you have." Rebecca felt a shiver run down her spine. "Why did you help me?" she asked cautiously. "Why do you do what you do?" The shopkeeper's smile grew faint. "I provide opportunities," he said slowly. "A chance for people to choose, to show what is truly in their hearts. You, Miss Turner, chose well." Rebecca looked at him, searching his face for answers, but found only mystery. "Will there be consequences?" she asked quietly. The shopkeeper tilted his head slightly, considering her question. "For you? No. But remember, Miss Turner, the power of the potions lies not in the liquid, but in the intention behind it. You have used it for good, and for that, there is always a reward." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Take care, Rebecca," he said softly. "And remember, the choices we make define us more than we know." With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving Rebecca standing in her doorway, the empty vial still in her hand. She felt a sense of calm, a peace that seemed to settle deep in her soul. She had chosen well, and perhaps in some way she had passed a test she never even knew she was taking. Back in the shop, the shopkeeper closed his ledger, his expression thoughtful. He looked up as the door opened once more and a figure stepped inside, drawn by the same unseen force that had brought all the others. "Welcome," the shopkeeper said, his voice as soft and inviting as ever, "to curiosities and concoctions. How may I assist you?" The cycle continued, the choices waiting to be made, each one revealing a new truth, a new path, a new destiny. The potions were not good or evil, they were mirrors, reflecting the hearts of those who dared to seek their power, and as long as the door remained open, the shopkeeper would be there, waiting, watching, and smiling